So, as the steering committee got together several months ago to prepare for the conference this year, we were throwing out ideas as to what might be a good topics for people to hear about this year. And interestingly, nothing in traditional cardiovascular medicine came up on the topic list, which is interesting for the state of Minnesota to have that be the case. But it is the case, and there are a lot of other areas that, though, are of high interest, and you saw some of those already today. And we wanted to focus on the gastroenterology segment of the market today on our panel. And it is an investment area that has had some investments in it. In fact, if you look at all the sectors within gastroenterology, including obesity, including colonoscopy, and various other segments, it actually has had $500 million worth of investments in the last 5 to 6 years, which is quite significant. That said, the exit liquidity market has not been as dramatic as we would like to see, or the investors would like to see within the market, and we kind of want to explore some of the dynamics in the market as to why that is, whether it might be changing going forward, and things of that nature. So to that end, we did invite several panelists to join us today, so I wanted to go through ahead, have everyone introduce themselves and give a little bit of background about their experience in gastroenterology. And my co-chair here is Doug Kelly from Alloy, who is a longtime investor in BarX, which is a fantastic success story in this field. So I might start with Doug and have the panelists introduce themselves.
You got it? Oh, here we go. Great.
Oh.
Yes, my name is Doug Kelly. I'm venture capital with Alloy Ventures. We're managing about $1 billion of early stage fund out in California, doing half IT and half healthcare. We do medical devices, diagnostics, and gene sequencing, laboratory instrumentation, things like that. And I guess my relevance to the panel was that I was the Series A, I led the Series A for BarX. And at the time, it was just Bob Ganz and Brian Zellickson and some contractors at Stellar Tech and no employees. And we built a team around it, focused on clinical data, that would be important to a potential acquirer. I think it's an important lesson of BarX actually is that the clinical data is what made it so attractive to Covidien. We sold it to Covidien for $325 million up front, plus some milestones. They were pretty close to finishing. So great transaction, great interaction, and a lot of interesting lessons learned, which we'll get talking about here.
Great, appreciate it. So, and I'm Kathy Toon, Thomas McNerney and Partners. We are investors in a company called Thorax, which is a local company that's focused on reflux disease. They just have received PMA approval on their surgical implant product for reflux disease. They generated data from about a 100-patient study with 2-year follow-up, and the data were tremendously successful. The panel met in January, and then in what at least I believe to be quite a rapid turnaround, in 10 weeks, the FDA came back post the panel and approved the product. So now the company's in the launch phases of the product, and it's a very exciting time, obviously, for the company. And we can talk about that a little bit more as we go forward as well, because Bob Ganz, Dr. Ganz, was one of the PIs for that study as well. So I'll throw it to Bob.
Hi, I'm Bob Ganz. I'm from Minneapolis. I'm a practicing gastroenterologist here. We did start BarX Medical, actually in my garage in Minnetonka, about 1999, 2000. It was a very successful venture for a lot of reasons. We learned a lot from the reflux devices that failed in the past. And I think those reflux devices failed for a number of reasons. One reason is they didn't work very well. But another reason they failed is because they weren't well studied. And as Doug mentioned, there wasn't good clinical data to back them up. We learned that lesson, and we really made a huge effort to do good clinical trials for BarX, and that made a difference. GI is a funny field. there's a lot of odd things about GI. You know, I was reading the New England Journal of Medicine last couple of weeks, because I like to read journals that are somewhat to the left of the New York Times. But I was reading the journal, and it was so interesting to see how different the GI space is from, like, say, cardiology. So there were 2 studies, cardiac studies in there, and there was a 1% difference between these, you know, the control and the device, or surgery and stenting. And a 1% difference, that's 1 in 100 patients, that's enough to make the New England Journal. And the reason is because cardiology is a really hard endpoint, you know, death. Most people think that's a reasonably hard endpoint. And GI, 1% to us is a joke. I mean, we're a soft specialty. We're a lifestyle specialty. Our patients don't die. They suffer, but they don't die. I mean, reflux is a serious disease, and it can be significant, and it can kill you, but it takes decades to kill you. You don't die playing tennis from reflux. And, you know, a 1% difference in gas, you know, unless you're my wife, it doesn't make a huge difference. But, you know, a 1% difference in constipation, diarrhea, you know, a 1% difference in reflux, I mean, come on. We don't do 1% differences in GI. So Barracks really needed good clinical data because we're a soft outcome specialty. And so I think that's one of the lessons of GIs. You really need strong clinical data because we don't have hard endpoints. The other thing that we found, and I actually knew this, but we're a really odd specialty because most of our time and most of our revenue comes from doing a single screening procedure, colonoscopy, which is a really odd thing. So we generally take care of people, we're gastroenterologists, we generally take care of people who have no GI disease. I mean, think about that. 70% of my revenue comes from taking care of patients who have no GI disease, or healthy people. And they come in for a screening colonoscopy. And they come in for an hour, and I never see them again. Or I don't see them for 10 years. I mean, that's really weird. It's so weird that I actually hate to talk about it publicly. But we make so much money from doing that one screening procedure that not completely, but to a large extent, we're kind of disinterested in doing things that are complicated or tough or might hurt people. Because I can come in at 7:30 and I could do 15 columns and I could go home at 4:30 and I can make it to my kid's soccer game and I make a damn good living taking care of people with no disease. And so a device in GI, it has to be safe. It has to be beyond safe because gastroenterologists will not tolerate any risk at all. It has to be a zero-risk device. It has to fit into a 30-minute time window because that's what I can do my colons in. It has to be at least reasonably as lucrative as doing screening colons. And it's got to be something that doesn't take me out of my ambulatory surgery center a lot because that takes me away from my revenue source. So in many ways, GI is a really, really different specialty. And I think we learned a lot of those lessons at Barracks. We made the device idiot-proof, safe. I mean, you couldn't possibly screw it up. And we learned that from the reflux devices. There was no choice for the physicians. There was no power setting to do. All they could do was push a button. And for people who do screening colonoscopy all day, pushing a button was okay. It was safe, it was easy, there was no decision making, it was very precise, and we studied it to the point where we ended up with 70 peer-reviewed publications. And I can tell you we've treated 110,000 patients, we don't have a single death, which is amazing. It's more dangerous driving to the endoscopy center than it is having the procedure. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, all right, thanks, Bob. So next up is Mike Allen, and Mike is the CEO of a company called Xlumena, which is basically, and correct me if I'm wrong, which I may very well be, trying to take some gastroenterology-related surgical techniques and transform them into endoscopic techniques so that you can actually get the patients out of the hospital sooner, et cetera, save money. So I'll throw it to you.
Unlike Bob, our customers are the 2,000 interventional endoscopists that that don't do many colonoscopies. So these guys are more like surgeons than they are like general GI doctors. We make devices that are transoral, they're delivered through an endoscope, and they operate on organs that surround the GI tract. I'm going to show a short presentation and show you one of them, which is essentially an anastomotic connector, or a connector that brings two tissue layers together. The primary, although we do a lot of different procedures, we have 2 products on the market in Europe and 1 in the US. The primary one is to treat acute cholecystitis and gallstone disease. So you can imagine a 15-minute procedure where you can connect the gallbladder directly to the duodenum. It's only a 6-millimeter space, and then cure the acute cholecystitis or drain the stones out of the gallbladder. So this is a procedure without anesthesia, and you can easily do it in less than 30 minutes. And there are a number of other procedures as well, and I'll show you an animation as well as a case video, which is a gastrojejunostomy.
Okay, great, thank you. And last is John Shellhorn, and John currently is the CEO of a company called Monteris Medical, which is in neurosurgery, so clearly not GI. But most recently, prior to that, was this chief commercial officer at Varex, which of course has been this fantastic success as it was sold to Covidien, and was also the CEO of Softscope in the GI space.
Thanks. I'm sorry about that. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking at the panelists. I'm thinking Kathy was on my board at Softscope, Doug was on the board at Varex, and Dr. Ganz was the founder of Varex and was also the chief medical officer at Softscope, where I had been. So it's kind of like old home week up here. But my experience in GI kind of goes back about 20 years to the early mid-90s at Boston Scientific, first in Asia, as we were really introducing therapeutic GI devices to, in some cases for the first time, to hospitals and physicians in that part of the world. And then in the late 90s as a director of sales at microvasive endoscopy. That experience in working with therapeutic endoscopists, and I'll make this distinction between, a therapeutic endoscopist and someone who does primarily diagnostic endoscopy. And I think for those of you looking to either invest or otherwise in GI, you need to kind of understand where the products that you're looking at come into play. Later on, I ran a small company here in Minneapolis called Softscope Medical, and while we ultimately sold the technology to Fuji, I wouldn't have called it a success. But the lessons there that we learned in that were really clear. Certainly about the need for reimbursement. In this area. It was very difficult, and then how to take a device that we thought could really enhance and improve the colonoscopy procedure, but yet fall economically within the reimbursement that it handles. Varex, I think Dr. Ganz did a nice job of kind of describing the situation in Varex. It was a great success story. Being on the commercial side of that business, we were really armed with a couple of things that in the end proved indispensable. First was the board's willingness early on I'm talking 10 years ago now, to make a substantial investment in level 1 clinical evidence. I mean, if you look at the total amount of capital invested in Varex, and you look at how much of that was explicitly and specifically devoted to obtaining the clinical evidence, it was a massive amount, about a third, I think. So no small amount of guts, I think, on Doug's part and the rest of the board to see early on that if you are going to change behavior in GI, remember, gastroenterologists are internal medicine physicians, you need, bulletproof data. But even when you have that, you don't have enough, unfortunately, as you might in some other specialties, because the the headwind that you have is, and the competition. People would ask me, well, who's your competitor at Barracks? And of course, the answer was screening colonoscopy. Nothing could have improved Barracks' outcome better than it already was than screening colonoscopy somehow being negatively affected. Because you have 13 or so thousand gastroenterologists in the United States, as an example. You know, well more than 10,000 of them do pretty much nothing but screening and colonoscopies and EGDs. And those that are reasonably ambitious have absolutely more demand than they have the capacity to meet that demand. So, you know, you're talking to someone who's doing something 15 or 16 times a year and is making $1 million a year, and he's doing it well, and you're coming up to him and say, do a therapeutic procedure, one that, you know, you can argue we can continue to wait, but let's treat this person now. And that was a hard argument to make. So, you know, I respect certainly those that are really trying to reach the therapeutic endoscopist. You know, one last comment before I go on. The attraction, I think, to all of us that have been in GI for a long time, certainly myself over a long time, is GI is a little bit like the China market. And having lived in Asia for 13 years, I always had to check myself on this. But there are so many procedures. If you think gastroenterology, this year colonoscopy, there'll be 25 or 30 million colonoscopies performed in the United States this year, probably more than 30 million. And you say, if I can just get a little piece of some of that action, or EGDs, or some of these high volume procedures, you know, I can really make a go. I can really create a business from that. I don't need a big share. But the fact is that any procedure that has those kinds of volumes has been studied, picked over, and you have such an incredibly efficient delivery model that, you know, people understand where the sensitivity and the points are. So, you know, for those of you looking to invest, I think you have to really sort of look very carefully at that model and figure out where you